They say a kingdom is measured by the strength of its king, but they are wrong. A kingdom is measured by the single moment its king chooses one life over an entire throne. That was the sentence every child in Ashmore whispered long after the old banners had faded, because no one who stood inside the royal hall on that unforgettable afternoon ever forgot what they witnessed. Long before that day, however, King Adrian Blackwood was a name spoken with lowered voices and careful eyes. He was the youngest Alpha King in generations, crowned before his 30th birthday after leading the kingdom through years of uncertainty with relentless discipline instead of charm. His decisions were swift, his judgment unwavering, and his expression almost impossible to read. The people respected him because they believed he feared nothing. The nobles obeyed him because they believed he needed no one. Stories painted him as a ruler carved from marble instead of flesh, a man who treated every alliance, every ceremony, and every conversation with the same calm precision. Even within the towering walls of Blackwood Palace, servants stepped aside the moment they heard his measured footsteps crossing polished marble floors. Conversations faded. Smiles disappeared. The scent of cedar and winter pine that quietly followed the king became enough to remind everyone that perfection was expected inside his kingdom. Hidden among hundreds of royal attendants was Ethan Carter, a young Omega whose life was so ordinary that most nobles never bothered to remember his face. Ethan organized schedules, delivered sealed correspondence, prepared ceremonial records, and quietly corrected mistakes before anyone important ever noticed them. If a banquet unfolded flawlessly, someone else accepted the praise. If an event encountered problems, someone like Ethan worked through the night to prevent embarrassment for the crown. That invisible existence suited him well enough. Attention had never brought him kindness. Remaining unnoticed had become his greatest talent. Every morning before sunrise, Ethan crossed the palace gardens carrying stacks of documents while soft mist floated above trimmed hedges and marble fountains reflected the first pale light of dawn. He admired the peaceful beauty surrounding the palace even though he rarely allowed himself to stop walking. Deadlines mattered more than scenery. Duties mattered more than dreams. Whenever palace staff gathered for breakfast, Ethan usually chose the smallest table near the windows, content to enjoy quiet moments before another demanding day began. The older servants appreciated his gentle manners, but the younger noble aides often overlooked him entirely, speaking through him rather than to him as though he were simply another piece of palace furniture. Ethan never complained. He had learned years ago that resentment was exhausting, while patience cost nothing. Occasionally he caught a distant glimpse of King Adrian crossing an upper balcony surrounded by advisors dressed in dark formal coats. Their paths almost never crossed. Once or twice the king accepted documents directly from Ethan with nothing more than a brief nod before continuing toward another council meeting. Those encounters lasted only seconds, yet Ethan always found himself wondering whether the legendary Alpha King ever experienced ordinary moments at all, or whether carrying the weight of an entire kingdom had quietly stolen every simple happiness long before anyone noticed. Ethan quickly discovered that being invisible did not mean being left alone. In Blackwood Palace, the people who worked the hardest were often the easiest to overlook, and the quiet Omega became the perfect target for every unpleasant task no one else wanted to claim. If a shipment of records arrived late, Ethan stayed after sunset organizing every page. If a visiting noble demanded last-minute changes to a royal reception, Ethan quietly rewrote schedules while everyone else returned to comfortable rooms. If expensive decorations disappeared before an event, someone inevitably suggested that Ethan search every hallway because, as one senior attendant joked with a careless smile, he always seemed to have time. He never argued. He simply nodded, offered a polite answer, and continued walking. The palace itself was magnificent beyond imagination. Sunlight poured through towering stained glass windows each morning, painting brilliant colors across polished marble floors. Endless corridors connected libraries, council chambers, royal galleries, and elegant gardens where white roses bloomed almost year-round. Visitors admired the beauty, but Ethan knew another side of the palace. He knew which staircases echoed loudest before dawn, which storage rooms remained warm during winter, and which hallways nobles used whenever they wished to avoid common staff. Those hidden corners became his world. Sometimes he wondered if anyone would notice if he simply vanished for a day. The answer, he suspected, would only come when an important document failed to reach the right desk on time. Among the palace attendants, kindness existed, but it rarely belonged to those with influence. Martha, an elderly palace librarian, occasionally slipped fresh pastries into Ethan's satchel before he hurried to another assignment. Samuel, one of the stable hands, always greeted him with the same cheerful smile regardless of how exhausted they both looked. Those small moments reminded Ethan that goodness still survived beneath the heavy traditions of the royal court. Unfortunately, compassion carried little weight compared to noble pride. Younger aristocrats visiting the palace often treated attendants as though they were decorations rather than people. More than once, Ethan heard conversation stop the moment he entered a room, followed by quiet laughter as someone commented that Omega servants should learn to walk without making shadows. He pretended not to hear them. Experience had taught him that silence usually ended uncomfortable moments faster than wounded pride. Every few days, Ethan delivered sealed council documents directly outside the king's private office. The royal guards always accepted the folders with respectful efficiency, and Ethan never crossed the threshold without permission. Occasionally, as the heavy doors opened for another advisor, he caught only fragments of the world inside. A long conference table covered with maps. Senior ministers debating trade routes. The distant sound of King Adrian's calm voice asking thoughtful questions that silenced an entire room without ever becoming louder. Ethan found that remarkable. The king never seemed to command attention through anger. People simply listened because they believed every word carried purpose. Even so, Adrian remained an impossible mystery. No celebrations surrounded him. No unnecessary conversations delayed him. Every appearance followed precise schedules, as though the king himself lived according to rules no one else could see. One rainy afternoon, Ethan carried a stack of financial ledgers across the eastern corridor when two young noble heirs stepped into his path. One deliberately brushed against the books, sending several volumes onto the polished floor before offering an insincere apology that drew quiet laughter from his companion. Ethan knelt immediately, collecting every scattered ledger before moisture from the open windows could damage the pages. Neither noble offered assistance. They simply continued down the corridor discussing an upcoming royal banquet as though nothing had happened. Ethan watched them disappear before taking a slow breath and carefully straightening every folder once again. As he stood, he noticed someone at the far end of the corridor. King Adrian had emerged from a side passage with two council advisors. The distance between them stretched nearly 50 feet, yet Ethan instinctively lowered his eyes and continued toward the archives without expecting the king to acknowledge such an ordinary scene. Behind him, the quiet footsteps of the royal party continued through the corridor, but for reasons Ethan could not explain, the silence that followed felt strangely heavier than before. Preparations for the royal founders' banquet transformed Blackwood Palace into a world of polished perfection. Every chandelier was lowered and cleaned until thousands of crystal pieces reflected golden afternoon light across the grand halls. Fresh white lilies filled marble vases along every corridor, musicians rehearsed elegant melodies beneath painted ceilings, and royal servants hurried from room to room carrying embroidered table linens, silver candle holders, and carefully sealed invitations bearing the Blackwood crest. The celebration welcomed governors, military commanders, merchant leaders, and noble families from every corner of Ashmore, making it the most important social gathering of the year. Ethan found himself assigned to the Central Planning Office only 3 days before the event, a responsibility far greater than anything he had expected. His task seemed simple on paper. Every guest, every seat, every ceremonial announcement, and every formal introduction had to follow an exact schedule approved personally by the king. One misplaced document could embarrass an entire noble house. One delayed announcement could offend visiting dignitaries. Ethan understood the pressure immediately, yet he accepted every assignment with the same quiet determination that had carried him through years inside the palace. Long after sunset each evening, while many noble guests retired to luxurious chambers prepared for their arrival, Ethan remained surrounded by neatly stacked records, comparing attendance lists with handwritten notes from royal advisors. The soft glow of oil lamps became his only company as silence settled across the palace. Occasionally another attendant offered sympathetic smiles before leaving for the night, but Ethan never asked anyone to stay. He had grown accustomed to finishing difficult work alone. On the morning before the banquet, Lord Victor Ashcombe, one of the kingdom's wealthiest dukes, arrived with an entourage large enough to occupy nearly an entire wing of guest suites. His reputation had reached the palace years before he did. Intelligent, influential, and deeply proud of his ancient family name, Victor believed noble blood entitled him to privileges beyond ordinary protocol. Servants hurried to satisfy every request before it became a complaint. Ethan encountered the Duke while delivering revised seating charts to the Eastern Reception Gallery. Victor barely glanced at the carefully prepared documents before handing them back with visible disappointment. He declared that his family's table should stand closer to the royal platform because generations of Ashcombs had served the crown with distinction. Ethan respectfully explained that only the king possessed authority to approve seating changes after the official schedule had been finalized. His voice remained calm, his posture respectful, and every word followed palace etiquette exactly as he had been taught. Even so, Victor's pleasant smile cooled almost instantly. Without raising his voice, the Duke remarked that palace attendants had become unusually confident for people whose names history would never remember. Several younger nobles nearby exchanged amused looks, while Ethan simply lowered his head and apologized for any inconvenience despite knowing he had done nothing improper. He returned to the planning office carrying the unchanged seating chart, silently hoping the uncomfortable exchange had already ended. Unfortunately, palace gossip traveled faster than official messages. By afternoon, whispers spread among attendants that Lord Victor disliked the quiet Omega responsible for royal scheduling. Some advised Ethan to avoid crossing the Duke's path during the banquet. Others warned him that influential nobles rarely forgot even the smallest perceived insult. Ethan thanked them for their concern, although he privately wondered why honesty always seemed to create enemies among people who valued appearances above fairness. Meanwhile, throughout the palace, another quiet change unfolded almost unnoticed. King Adrian began conducting shorter council meetings while personally reviewing final banquet preparations instead of delegating every detail to senior ministers. His advisors considered the decision unusual, but none questioned it. Wherever the king appeared, conversations immediately shifted toward official business. Ethan caught only distant glimpses of Adrian crossing balconies or inspecting ceremonial halls with measured attention. Their eyes never met, yet for reasons Ethan could not explain, he increasingly sensed an invisible current moving beneath the palace's polished calm, as though every perfectly arranged flower, every carefully rehearsed greeting, and every whispered conversation were quietly leading toward a single moment no one could yet foresee. The evening of the royal founders' banquet arrived beneath a clear sky. Filled with brilliant stars, and Blackwood Palace glowed like a beacon visible for miles beyond the capital. Hundreds of candles illuminated the grand hall while crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble columns and banners embroidered with the royal crest. Noble families entered one after another dressed in elegant formal attire, their conversations blending into a constant murmur of greetings, compliments, and careful political observations. Musicians performed graceful orchestral pieces from the elevated gallery, creating an atmosphere so refined that every movement seemed rehearsed long before the first guest had arrived. Ethan had been on his feet since before sunrise, making final adjustments to seating assignments, confirming ceremonial introductions, and ensuring every official document rested exactly where it belonged. Although exhaustion weighed heavily on him, he took quiet satisfaction in seeing months of preparation unfold almost perfectly. Every table reflected precise planning. Every servant understood their responsibilities. Every honored guest reached the correct place without confusion. For a brief moment, Ethan allowed himself to believe the evening might pass peacefully. That hope lasted only until Lord Victor Ashcombe entered the central reception area surrounded by influential nobles who laughed a little louder whenever he spoke. The Duke carried himself with effortless confidence, greeting military commanders and governors as though they were longtime companions. Several council members welcomed him warmly despite his well-known arrogance, proving once again that influence often outweighed courtesy inside royal society. Ethan noticed Victor studying the seating arrangements from across the hall before their eyes briefly met. The Duke smiled politely, but the expression never reached his eyes. Ethan immediately looked away and continued delivering revised ceremonial notes to the Master of Ceremonies. Minutes later, one of the palace attendants hurried toward Ethan with visible concern. A messenger from the Eastern Guest Gallery explained that Lord Victor wished to review the placement of several distinguished families before the formal procession began. Ethan knew refusing was impossible. Carrying the official seating ledger against his chest, he crossed the magnificent ballroom while dozens of conversations echoed around him. As he approached the eastern side of the hall, he found Victor standing beside a group of prominent nobles beneath an enormous stained glass window depicting the founding of Ashmore. The Duke accepted the ledger without thanking him and slowly examined each page. His companions watched with amused curiosity rather than genuine interest. After several moments, Victor closed the book with deliberate care and returned it to Ethan. He remarked that it was unfortunate palace attendants sometimes confused obedience with authority. Ethan calmly explained that every placement reflected the king's final approval and could no longer be altered without direct royal instruction. His respectful tone remained unchanged, yet a faint silence spread among those standing nearby. Victor took one slow step closer. Still smiling, he observed that young attendants should remember their position before speaking on behalf of the crown. Ethan lowered his head once more and apologized if his explanation had sounded improper. He attempted to step aside so the conversation could end, but Victor casually reached forward and placed a hand around Ethan's wrist, stopping him before he could leave. The gesture itself appeared almost harmless to anyone watching from a distance, yet the entire movement carried unmistakable authority, silently declaring that Ethan would remain exactly where the Duke wished. Conversations nearest them began fading one after another. Several servants noticed the scene but immediately looked away, unwilling to involve themselves in a disagreement between nobility and a palace attendant. Ethan remained perfectly still, neither struggling nor responding with anger. He simply waited, hoping respect and patience would end the uncomfortable encounter. Across the vast grand hall, the ceremonial announcement signaling the arrival of the royal household echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. Every guest instinctively turned toward the grand staircase as musicians fell silent. King Adrian Blackwood appeared at the top of the marble steps wearing formal black and silver ceremonial attire, his composed expression unchanged as he surveyed the assembled gathering. The hall bowed in perfect unison. Ethan could not raise his head while his wrist remained held in place, unaware that from the king's elevated position, the first thing Adrian saw that evening was not the magnificent celebration prepared in his honor, but one quiet Omega standing motionless while another man refused to let him go. Silence swept across the grand hall with astonishing speed. The orchestra lowered its instruments. Conversations dissolved into uneasy stillness. Even the servants nearest the towering entrance instinctively stopped moving as King Adrian descended the broad marble staircase with the same measured confidence that had made rulers and diplomats respect him long before they understood him. Every polished step echoed through the chamber, not because it was loud, but because no one dared make another sound. Ethan remained where he stood, his wrist still held by Lord Victor Ashcombe. He kept his eyes lowered, convinced the king would pass without noticing a palace attendant caught in an awkward exchange among powerful nobles. After all, men like Ethan were rarely the center of royal attention. They existed to keep ceremonies flawless, not to interrupt them. Victor appeared equally unconcerned at first. He released a courteous bow toward the approaching monarch while still delaying Ethan's departure, wearing the practiced smile of a nobleman who believed protocol always favored status over circumstance. Adrian acknowledged the assembled guests with a slight inclination of his head before continuing forward. His expression remained composed, revealing nothing. One advisor followed several steps behind, carrying ceremonial documents, while members of the royal guard maintained a respectful distance. The king neither hurried nor slowed. He simply walked until he reached the gathering beneath the stained glass window where Ethan and Victor stood. Those closest instinctively stepped aside, creating a quiet circle around them. Ethan finally looked up, expecting a formal greeting before the banquet continued. Instead, Adrian's calm grey eyes rested briefly on Victor's hand, which still encircled Ethan's wrist. Nothing in the king's face changed, yet something invisible shifted throughout the room. The warmth of celebration seemed to disappear, replaced by an impossible stillness that spread from one guest to another. Victor noticed it as well. His smile became slightly uncertain, although he attempted to maintain his confidence. He offered an explanation before anyone had asked for one, saying that he had merely been clarifying an issue involving banquet arrangements with a diligent palace attendant. Adrian did not immediately answer. His attention remained entirely on the hand that had not yet let Ethan go. Seconds passed. They felt much longer. Ethan's heart beat faster, not from fear of punishment, but from confusion. He had never stood this close to the king before. The familiar scent of cedar and winter pine lingered softly in the air, steady rather than overwhelming, carrying the same quiet certainty as Adrian's presence. Then, with remarkable composure, Adrian extended one gloved hand toward Ethan without taking his eyes off Victor. The gesture was simple, almost effortless. Ethan hesitated only briefly before understanding the silent instruction. Victor's fingers loosened on their own. Ethan carefully stepped away and stood beside the king, lowering his head once again. No accusation had been spoken. No command had been raised. Adrian finally turned toward the Duke. When he spoke, his voice was so calm that several guests leaned forward simply to hear it. "Lord Ashcombe," he said, "there are many honored guests within these walls tonight. I expect every one of them to remember that respect is measured by actions, not titles." Victor immediately bowed deeper, replying that no disrespect had been intended. Adrian regarded him quietly for another moment before taking one small step closer, close enough that only those nearest could clearly hear his next words. His voice became softer instead of louder, carrying absolute certainty without the slightest trace of anger. "Touch my Omega again," Adrian said, "and I will burn this kingdom down before I allow disrespect to stand beside my throne." No one moved. No one breathed loudly enough to disturb the silence. The word spread through the grand hall faster than any shout ever could. Shock appeared across every noble face. Ministers stared in disbelief. Servants exchanged astonished glances before quickly lowering their eyes. Even the royal guard seemed momentarily frozen. Ethan himself forgot to think. One sentence had overturned everything he believed about his place inside the palace. The king had not defended a title, a treaty, or a political alliance. He had publicly claimed the quiet Omega whom almost everyone else had spent years overlooking, and in that single unforgettable moment, the entire kingdom realized that nothing inside Blackwood Palace would ever remain the same. The silence lingered long after the king resumed walking toward the royal platform. No one seemed willing to become the first person to speak, as though even ordinary conversation might somehow disturb the weight of what had just happened. Lord Victor stepped back with perfect composure, offering another respectful bow before quietly withdrawing to his assigned table. His expression remained polite, yet the confidence that had surrounded him only moments earlier had vanished beneath careful restraint. Around the hall, nobles exchanged discreet glances while pretending to admire the decorations or study the evening program. Servants continued pouring drinks and presenting elegant courses, but even they sensed the atmosphere had changed forever. Ethan remained frozen where he stood until the master of ceremonies gently reminded him that the banquet schedule had to continue. He apologized instinctively, gathered the official ledger against his chest, and returned to his duties with steady hands that hid the confusion racing through his thoughts. The words he had heard refused to leave his mind. He could not understand them because nothing in his experience explained them. The king barely knew him. They had exchanged only a handful of formal greetings over several years. Ethan searched every memory, wondering whether he had unknowingly committed some mistake that required such extraordinary attention, but nothing made sense. Meanwhile, Adrian carried himself through the remainder of the reception exactly as every guest expected a monarch to behave. He welcomed ambassadors, accepted reports from governors, thanked military commanders for their service, and congratulated merchants whose trade agreements had strengthened the kingdom. His calm demeanor never faltered. Anyone arriving late might have believed the evening had unfolded without the slightest interruption. Yet beneath that flawless composure, several members of the royal council quietly noticed something unusual. Throughout the banquet, Adrian's gaze drifted toward the palace attendants more often than toward the entertainment prepared in his honor. More specifically, it always seemed to settle on one quiet Omega moving carefully through the hall with documents tucked beneath his arm. Chancellor Benjamin Hawthorne had served the Blackwood family for more than 30 years. Age had sharpened rather than weakened his ability to observe details others ignored. As the evening progressed, he finally understood something he had overlooked for months. Whenever Ethan approached the royal platform to deliver revised schedules or ceremonial notices, Adrian always accepted them personally instead of allowing another official to do so. Whenever additional assignments appeared unexpectedly, they somehow reached other attendants before Ethan could be burdened with them. Whenever difficult visitors requested unnecessary changes, palace supervisors quietly redirected those demands elsewhere without ever explaining why. None of those decisions had seemed remarkable by themselves. Together, However, they revealed a careful pattern that could only have begun with the king's own instructions. Late in the evening, after the final toast concluded and musicians welcomed guests onto the ballroom floor, Benjamin approached Adrian during a brief pause between official obligations. Speaking quietly enough that no one else could hear, the Chancellor asked whether there was anything further requiring his attention. Adrian looked toward the crowded hall before, answering with characteristic calm. "Ensure Ethan Carter receives tomorrow morning free from duty," he said. "He has worked enough." Benjamin blinked in surprise. Palace schedules had already been approved weeks earlier, and Adrian had never before singled out an individual attendant by name. Even so, the Chancellor merely bowed. "It will be done, Your Majesty." Adrian offered a slight nod before turning his attention back toward the gathering guests. Benjamin walked away carrying far more than a simple scheduling request. At last he understood the meaning behind countless quiet decisions that had appeared unrelated for nearly 2 years. The king's protection had not begun beneath the stained glass window that evening. It had begun long before anyone realized it existed. Ethan, completely unaware of those hidden acts, continued clearing documents from abandoned tables after midnight. While most nobles celebrated another successful royal banquet, he believed the greatest mystery of the evening was still waiting for an explanation. He did not know that the answer had been quietly unfolding around him every single day, hidden inside ordinary moments he had never thought important enough to remember. By sunrise the following morning, the story had already escaped the palace walls. Merchants repeated it over steaming cups of coffee, soldiers whispered about it during the changing of the guard, and noble households quietly debated what the king's astonishing declaration truly meant. Some believed Adrian had simply defended the dignity of the crown. Others insisted there had to be a hidden political motive. The one explanation almost no one accepted was the simplest one, that the king had acted because he genuinely cared about a quiet Omega attendant whose name most of the kingdom had never heard before. Inside Blackwood Palace, however, the mood had shifted in ways no official proclamation could disguise. Conversation stopped whenever Ethan entered a room. Servants who had barely noticed him before now greeted him with uncertain respect, while several senior attendants carefully reminded younger staff to follow every palace rule without exception. Ethan found the sudden attention deeply uncomfortable. He had spent years trying to remain unnoticed, and overnight he had become the subject of endless speculation. Even the morning he had unexpectedly been granted away from duty failed to bring him peace. He wandered through the palace gardens just after dawn, hoping the quiet paths lined with white roses would calm his thoughts. Instead, every memory from the previous evening returned with perfect clarity. He could still hear the king's calm voice. He could still remember the stunned expression surrounding them. Most of all, he could not understand why Adrian had called him his Omega. Ethan had never received such a title from anyone. As he paused beside a marble fountain reflecting the pale morning sky, Chancellor Benjamin Hawthorne approached with his usual measured pace. The older man offered a gentle smile before standing beside him in comfortable silence. After a moment Benjamin asked whether Ethan had enjoyed his unexpected morning of rest. Ethan thanked him politely but admitted he remained confused. Gathering his courage, he quietly asked whether the king had spoken in anger the previous evening or whether he had meant every word. Benjamin looked across the peaceful gardens instead of answering immediately. Finally he spoke with careful honesty. He explained that in more than 3 decades of serving the Blackwood family, he had never known Adrian to say anything he did not fully intend. Those words settled heavily inside Ethan's heart. Before he could ask another question, Benjamin offered a final piece of quiet advice. He suggested that Ethan stop assuming the previous evening had been the beginning of something extraordinary. Sometimes, he said with a knowing smile, what appeared to be the beginning was actually the moment when a long-hidden truth finally became impossible to hide. Those mysterious words lingered long after the Chancellor departed. Meanwhile, elsewhere inside the palace, Lord Victor Ashcombe held a private meeting with several influential nobles who had attended the banquet. Outwardly the discussion focused on trade agreements and regional taxes, but beneath every polite sentence rested the same unsettling concern. If the king was willing to elevate an ordinary palace attendant in front of the entire court, what other traditions might he be willing to challenge next? Some worried about their political influence. Others feared losing privileges that noble families had protected for generations. No one openly criticized Adrian, yet quiet resistance slowly began taking shape behind carefully closed doors. Adrian, for his part, seemed entirely aware that change had begun. Standing alone inside his private study overlooking the eastern gardens, he watched Ethan walking quietly along the stone pathways below. There was no triumph in the king's expression, only calm certainty. He had protected Ethan publicly because the time for silence had ended. He also understood that every choice carried consequences. Powerful families would question him. Old alliances would become uncertain. Trusted advisors might disagree with the path ahead. None of that altered his decision. For the first time in years, Adrian had allowed the kingdom to see what his heart had already known, and although storms were beginning to gather beyond the palace walls, he no longer intended to face them alone. The days that followed revealed a kingdom standing at a crossroads. No armies marched across the borders, no castles fell, and no banners were torn from their towers, yet a quieter conflict unfolded inside council chambers, private estates, and whispered conversations that carried more influence than public speeches ever could. Noble families who had spent generations protecting ancient customs questioned whether the king's recent action signaled the beginning of broader reforms. Some argued that tradition gave the kingdom stability. Others privately admitted that traditions which demanded silence from good people were becoming increasingly difficult to defend. Adrian listened to every concern with the same calm patience that had always defined his reign, but unlike before, he no longer allowed fear of controversy to postpone decisions he believed were right. During the first royal council meeting after the banquet, several influential lords requested clarification regarding palace protocol. Their questions sounded respectful, yet each one circled the same issue without speaking it directly. Would the king's public declaration change the expectations surrounding rank, privilege, and access to the royal household? Adrian answered every inquiry with remarkable simplicity. He reminded the council that dignity belonged to every loyal citizen, regardless of birth, title, or occupation. Respect, he explained, was not a reward reserved for powerful families but the foundation upon which every lasting kingdom was built. His words filled the chamber with thoughtful silence because no one could challenge the principle without exposing their own prejudice. Outside the council room, Ethan continued performing his responsibilities with the same humility that had always guided him. He insisted on carrying documents himself, declined unnecessary special treatment, and politely thanked every servant who suddenly addressed him with greater courtesy than before. More than once he quietly asked supervisors to stop assigning other attendants to assist him simply because of the king's public attention. He wanted nothing except the opportunity to continue serving honestly. Those requests only strengthened the admiration many palace workers already felt toward him. They realized that recognition had not changed Ethan's character in the slightest. One afternoon, while organizing royal archives inside the palace library, Ethan unexpectedly found Adrian standing beside a tall window overlooking the gardens. No advisors accompanied the king. No guards interrupted the peaceful silence. For the first time, they were simply two people sharing the same quiet room. Ethan immediately bowed and apologized for disturbing him, but Adrian gently asked him to remain. The king picked up one of the old history books resting on a nearby table and observed that kingdoms often celebrated victories while forgetting the ordinary people whose quiet dedication made those victories possible. Ethan listened without fully understanding why Adrian had chosen to say those words to him. Gathering his courage, he finally asked the question that had remained in his heart since the banquet. He asked why the king had protected someone so ordinary. Adrian looked toward the afternoon sunlight streaming through the library windows before answering. He explained that true worth was rarely announced by the loudest voices. Sometimes it revealed itself through years of kindness, honesty, and quiet perseverance that almost everyone else failed to notice. Then Adrian admitted something that left Ethan speechless. He said he had first noticed Ethan nearly 2 years earlier when a young servant had accidentally damaged an important shipment of royal documents. Instead of blaming the frightened attendant, Ethan had quietly stayed until dawn repairing every record himself while allowing others to believe the work had always been completed on schedule. Adrian had watched from an upper gallery without revealing his presence. That single act of selfless compassion had remained with him ever since. Ethan felt tears gathering despite every effort to remain composed. He had believed no one had seen those forgotten moments. Adrian smiled gently for the first time Ethan had ever witnessed and said that a king who failed to notice the quietest heart inside his own palace did not deserve to wear the crown. In that peaceful library, surrounded by shelves filled with the history of countless generations, Ethan finally understood that the greatest changes shaping a kingdom did not always begin with grand ceremonies or public victories. Sometimes they began when one person chose to truly see another, and once that choice was made, neither their lives nor the future of the kingdom could ever return to what they had been before. Seasons passed, and with them the uncertainty that had once settled over Blackwood Palace slowly gave way to something stronger than tradition alone. King Adrian never attempted to erase the kingdom's history. Instead, he chose to honor its finest values while quietly leaving behind customs that had taught people to measure worth by birth instead of character. New policies encouraged every royal servant to receive the same legal protections as members of noble households, while palace appointments were increasingly based upon ability, dedication, and integrity. At first, many influential families resisted the changes, convinced that the old order could never truly disappear. Yet every reform produced calmer courts, fairer judgments, and greater trust among the people. Even merchants traveling from distant provinces remarked that the kingdom seemed different. There was still discipline. There was still respect. But there was also hope. Ethan never sought recognition for the changes unfolding around him. He continued approaching every responsibility with the same quiet humility that had first captured Adrian's attention years before. He remained kind to new attendants who felt overwhelmed during their first weeks at the palace, remembered the names of elderly servants who often went unnoticed, and still paused every morning beside the palace gardens before beginning another day of work. Those simple habits never changed, no matter how much the world around him did. The people admired him not because the king had spoken for him, but because they gradually discovered the same gentle character Adrian had seen long before anyone else. One bright spring morning, the royal council gathered once more inside the grand hall where everything had begun. This time there were no whispered arguments hiding behind polite smiles. Noble families, governors, military leaders, scholars, merchants, and palace staff stood together beneath the towering stained glass windows that reflected warm sunlight across the marble floor. Adrian addressed the assembly with his familiar calm voice, reminding them that every generation faced a single defining choice. A kingdom could cling to fear until fear became its identity, or it could choose courage and become stronger because of it. Then, before the entire court, he formally announced Ethan Carter as royal consort, not because of status or political advantage, but because he represented the compassion, honesty, and quiet strength that every ruler should treasure. This time the hall did not fall into stunned silence. Instead, one person after another bowed with genuine respect until the entire chamber stood united. Even Lord Victor Ashcombe lowered his head without hesitation, having long since recognized that dignity could never be diminished by offering it to another. As the ceremony concluded, Adrian extended his hand toward Ethan just as he had once done during the banquet that had changed both of their lives. Ethan accepted it with a peaceful smile instead of uncertainty. Together they walked through the palace gardens where white roses bloomed beneath clear blue skies and fountains reflected the afternoon sun. Palace servants greeted them warmly, children visiting with their families waved excitedly, and elderly citizens smiled with quiet satisfaction as the royal couple passed. Years later, historians filled countless pages describing Adrian's successful reign, prosperous trade agreements, and wise leadership, yet when ordinary people gathered around fireplaces or shared stories with younger generations, those achievements were rarely the first memories they chose to tell. Instead, they remembered the king who noticed the quietest heart inside his palace, the Omega who never allowed kindness to disappear from his character even after receiving honor beyond imagination, and the day an entire kingdom discovered that true greatness was not measured by power alone. It was measured by the courage to protect what was right, to cherish those whom others overlooked, and to build a future where every person could stand with dignity beneath the same sky. And in the center of the capital, beside the marble gardens where Adrian and Ethan often walked together, a simple inscription was eventually carved into stone for future generations. It did not celebrate conquest or wealth. It simply read, "The strongest kingdom is the one where every heart is seen."